Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you all today to talk about the American Rescue Plan and charter schools. We did a similar webinar about a year ago, and I think the good news is that in terms of policy at the federal level, there hasn't been a whole lot of change, but what I'm going to do in our presentation today is just touch on just some of the key components of the law and the funding allocations and some of the more recent guidance that the Department of Education has issued, as well as some of the other agencies to guide schools in their response to COVID. Happy to take any questions when we get to that. So just starting at the top, by way of reminder, there's been a lot of money allocated since 2020. In total, about $190 billion has gone out under the 3 COVID relief bills, which makes the regular appropriations for K-12 education at the federal level pale in comparison, which for comparison here is $42 billion. So as we've known, there's a lot of money coming down the pipeline. And in addition to the specific ESSER funds that have flowed through those 3 different relief bills, specifically for education. In the last bill, there was special allocations to serve homeless students, funding for IDEA, as well as the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund. Does not roll off the tongue as well as ESSER, but that is a $350 billion pot of funding that doesn't go to schools, but does have some educational implications. So just in case you don't think about this every day, the funds that have gone out under ARP go to states based on their Title I shares, and then the state is able to keep 10%, and that's 10% of a fairly significant allocation. 5% must be used for learning loss interventions, and then there are some other set-asides to ensure that certain priorities are met with respect to enrichment, after-school programs. And then the funds that go to local educational agencies, and this is a big deal, particularly for charter schools, is based on Title I shares. So if your charter school is a Title I, is a local educational agency for Title I purposes, you are getting your own funding. If you're not your own LEA, you might get funding from your district. And I think in some states, that's probably still working its way out. But about 50% of charters are LEAs. So at least on paper, the amount of funding that those charters would get is a little bit more straightforward. And then at the local level, there is, again, a 20% set aside for floor, really, for using evidence-based strategies to address learning loss. Oh, let's jump back to that one. So the timeline for obligating funds. This is a technical but significant issue. All the funds have to be obligated by the end of the fiscal year 23, and then states have to award all ESSER funds within 1 year of receipt, which is getting to be about now, and we'll touch on that soon. And then because of additional flexibility that's available at the federal level, really we're talking about the end of fiscal year, September 30th, 2024 for ARP funds. So it's a short time frame that LEAs have to get all of that money out the door and spent. So allowable uses of funds, really anything that's permitted under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, Adult Family Ed, Perkins CTE, those are all permitted. But sometimes it's not quite clear to say that all activities are permitted that are authorized under those acts. So there are lists that the department has provided to spell that out, what that might look like in terms of a COVID response. It also highlights the need to address the specific needs of subgroups of students, low income, disabled students, homeless, etc. So all of these things, technology, sanitation, this all should be fairly familiar. There's very little that it's excluded as long as there's a justification that is connected to the pandemic response. We'll get a little bit more into that. So that's just a brief overview of what the law actually does and permits in terms of use of funds. The good news, and maybe bad news, is that all state ESSER plans have been approved. So as of actually yesterday, all state plans have been approved and all funds have been allocated to states. I'd say bad news partly in jest, but that just means that those plans, whatever they are now have the department's stamp of approval, and the fact sheets and information about state plans can be found on the department's website. Oh, yep, thanks. They also include a link there that allows you to look at local educational agency plans. I think there are mixed in terms of where those links take you to, if that's something that you want to embark on, just a heads up. The department also has a relief spending tracker, and this is the link here. If you have questions about where your individual state is in terms of spend down, when you go in there, you'll see, at least in terms of data that's been reported back to the Department of Education as of November 30th. It's a relatively low percentage. In some states, some large states like New York, I think they're at 4% of ARP funding has been actually spent. Now, that's been in the media and made an issue of in a political sense. Obviously, it's complicated as to the difference between obligating funds and when funds are actually spent and when it gets reported back. But I think overall, the takeaway from that tracker is that there's a lot of funding that still has not yet been obligated. So I'm just going to touch on some of the questions about uses of funds and resources that are available. Again, it's very flexible in terms of funding. I think what folks have been looking for has been creative uses of funding for problem solving for immediate issues. It's not always helpful to say, well, you can spend it on whatever you need to. And then there are some bright lines, such as not using the funds for bonuses, merit pay, or similar expenditures unless it's connected to COVID-19. They've made that statement. And some of this guidance here related to providing additional pay. Again, some of the examples of when that can happen. The department has specifically addressed additional transportation costs and how you might go about procuring equipment, hiring additional bus drivers. And so they put out some guidance this fall, and there's an FAQ that's linked to provide some additional amplification on how to use ARP funds for that. And then obviously, again, with the timeline for funding, the focus is on non-sustained costs over long periods of time, putting down large down payments on things with high upfront costs like curriculum, HVAC, those sorts of things. Again, more examples: instructional materials, buildings, facilities, modular classrooms are permitted, although some additional approvals must be attended to. Renovation and construction, budgetary shortfalls, vaccines, PPE, and masks. Again, controversial in terms of the department's implementation of ARP with certain states, but as a use of funds, they are permitted. So the department in the summer and fall has had office hours and has done their best to post the recordings and the slides. Some of that information is actually a little bit more illustrative than what's in the guidance itself. So if you have specific questions, especially on issues related to facilities upgrades, renovations, and constructions, I would point you to the sessions that they did specifically on that. They also did written guidance on strategies for addressing the impact of lost instructional time, and that link is there. Again, more recently, there's obviously been in the news with Omicron, but even before Omicron, significant staffing shortages and issues. The department issued a letter to outline some strategies for how ARP can be used to address labor shortages. They worked with the IRS to have an FAQ on bringing back retirees for bus drivers in particular, and how to, and I think that's for teachers too, but how to work and still receive pensions so you're not double dipping. Waiving commercial driver license to get folks driving buses, additional flexibility for AmeriCorps members. So these are some additional resources that if you're not aware of, you might want to check out. So how have funds been used? It's kind of interesting to see, and there's a lot of interest in where districts are using that funding. There's a company called Burbio that has been tracking, looking at state and local plans, comprising a little less than half school districts and spending. And not surprisingly, a large percentage is going to summer learning and after school programs. HVAC was up there, student mobile devices, tutoring is also possible, is also up there, as well as transportation. And I have a link there. We're not sure yet to the extent that that data set includes charter schools. I'll touch on this at the end, but just so you're aware, they're focused on large districts, getting more bang for their buck for the data scraping that they're having to do. But there probably are some charter schools accounted for that. Future Ed at Georgetown has also been looking at that data set to look at get an early look of how districts are using that funding. And again, they found that half are using their funds for hiring or rewarding teachers, academic specialists, guidance counselors. About an average of $345 per pupil is being spent on teachers or other instructional staff. So these are considerations similar to what we put forward last year, to the extent that you are still in planning mode and trying to figure out how best to leverage these funds. Thinking within the time frame, what are the big measurable goals, is what we're hearing from districts and schools is a more strategic approach. Others are struggling with actually figuring out how to spend the money within certain constraints because of that time frame. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we're having this webinar, in order to share information about how to do that. As a charter community, we're always also concerned about the optics and preparation for federal audits that may be triggered for your charter school for the first time because of the threshold of federal funds that you're receiving. Making sure that you're aware that certain things do need approvals, like facilities, and being creative, but not doing something that required such a large justification and explanation that on the face of it, it looks dodgy or illegal. Also, just again, back on the state and local coronavirus, state and local fiscal relief funds, the Department of Treasury just issued updated guidance within the last week on that pot of funds. Again, it doesn't go to schools, it goes to local entities like cities for fiscal relief, but there are educational allowances in there, including expanded flexibility for use of facilities and school construction. I don't have a lot more information about how that might play out, but I just wanted to flag it, given the fact that we have this webinar today, that there is new guidance that addresses that. I think I've covered what's on this slide, so we can skip ahead. Again, how should charter schools benefit? Early on, we did some estimates as to how much funding should be going to charter schools based on their market share. We don't know In fact, whether this has been the case, probably not, because of the half of charter schools that aren't their own districts, but it should be $7 billion. We have been able to run interference for at least one state that was not for charter schools who are new or expanding, were not getting their allocations properly for the school year. So if you're working with charters, or you are a charter that was new this year or had an expanded enrollment, your ARP allocation should have reflected that. And there's been some confusion about how that works. And we're happy to help with that if you have questions. So at the National Alliance, we are interested in learning more about how charter schools are using their ESSER funds, and we're exploring the possibility of conducting a survey. So again, using the opportunity we have today with all of you on, if you are contacted by us or one of our partners about a survey and your use of funds, please respond and help us get a light lens into how the charter community is using these funds. And if you have something you want to share now, especially on learning loss or staffing shortages, I'd love to hear about it. Shoot me an email. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christy. Appreciate all of the insight and wonderful information on a less than easy to understand subject. So again, we will be sharing this slide deck along with the recording as part of the follow-up email that will go on here. So at this point in time, I would like to introduce Morgan Bottrell, Head of Charter Schools for Amazon Business, and he's going to talk with another one of our guests to talk about exactly how to utilize the funds that are being provided and do so in a fiscally responsible way. So with that, hand it off to you, Morgan.
All right, thank you, Patty. And thank you, Christy, for sharing with us at a high level of some of the federal initiatives that are going on in regarding the use of the ESSER funds. So I'd like to introduce William Bass from XED. And so I'm actually going to just turn it over to him to give himself or to allow him to introduce himself. And then also, William, if you can give an overview of who XED is.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invite to speak with you all. I am a Vice President of School Finance at XED, and I currently work with 6 charter schools as a back office budget and finance payroll support provider. So we at XED are a mission-driven support organization that focuses on providing charters with the back office support that they need around budgeting, financial reporting, accounting, payroll, retirement, and statutory reporting. And we support all of those functions for charters that contract with us to provide that back office support. XED works with we have 90 employees. We work with over 100 schools, and those schools have over 44,000 students enrolled. We work with a wide range of schools, from single standalone charter schools to multi-school organizations. And we also we have provided financing for 34 charter school facilities using $279 million in new markets tax credits. And so we are really mission driven on creating efficiencies for school leaders around their back office and business practices so that they are able to focus their time and efforts to the greatest degree possible on in-classroom instruction.
What I find interesting with you all in the space too, being mission driven, you also operate as a nonprofit too, correct?
That is right.
Excellent. And so let's go ahead and just dive into it. So I'm curious to know, and I'm sure the audience is as well, is what are some changes that XED and your clients made as schools started receiving ESSER funds?
So we in California, and this may not necessarily be the same sort of regulatory environment that other folks are working in, but we are a highly regulated environment in California. And so we knew when these federal funding sources began to show up that there was going to be a lot of reporting required, and that we were going to need to be able to dot all I's and cross all T's. So we made sure that the systems that we use with our clients were modified and upgraded to allow us to really sort of lean into cloud-based applications. It really sort of highlighted the need to move away from a paper-based sort of process and processing, and lean into cloud-based technologies, and to build into those tools that we're using with our clients, things like resource codes and reporting formats that allowed us to have conversations with our clients sort of at the front end and code identify what they intended to spend this funding on and how we were going to track those expenses, actual expenses over the course of not just one, but multiple fiscal years, so that we can tie out year over year what's been spent, what is still to be spent, and also to have explicit conversations with our school leaders about how they intend to use this funding and how this funding supports both the immediate response necessary to COVID and the long-term strategic vision and goals of the organization. So we really leaned into tools like our budget dashboard and our reporting templates. We use cloud-based procurement and financial software that we've modified to allow our clients to interact with us and help us identify what they're spending and when they're spending it. So far, our clients have been allocated over $232 million in COVID response funding across multiple federal and state funding sources.
So it sounds like a large chunk of money to have to manage.
Absolutely.
Essentially what you're saying. So tell us a little bit more about being in California and highly regulated. Can you give us some examples of those regulations that you're seeing?
So, for example, time and effort reporting, which is sort of you can sort of draw at least a dotted line between the uses of this funding and the requirements that we've had under programs like Title I. And in California, when we multi-fund positions, for example, there's a regular and ongoing amount of paperwork required to demonstrate that what that individual is doing is actually supporting that federal funding source or the goal of that funding program. And our auditors ask to see show us the time and effort reporting for this individual in this pay period. And so we will have to produce documentation that individual worked on task A or task B or task C. Some of our schools, because of the impacts of COVID on their budgets, end up using multiple funding sources to support a single position. And that does create a lot of paperwork in terms of tracking what that individual has been doing on a weekly basis, on a daily basis in some instances. So what we do try to make sure with our clients is that if we're going to fund positions using these sources, we're making an attempt at least to try and say, can we fully fund one position with one source? Because it simplifies the amount of paperwork that we have to complete and the amount of tracking that our clients have to do on each of these individuals. I think that's probably some of the most onerous in terms of individual time tracking, but we also want to make sure that if, for example, they plan to make a purchase with some of these sources, and many of them do, outside of relatively low cost items like masks and sanitizer, if, for example, there are upgrades to HVAC systems or major investments in capital type purchases, large dollar item equipment or HVAC upgrades or physical changes to the classroom or the building, that should be reviewed and approved by our State Department of Education to make sure that we receive approval for a capital outlay before we go ahead and make that purchase. And also making sure that our clients are aware of the fact that when they're making these purchases, they still have to comport with federal procurement guidelines, which they may not necessarily be thinking about when they're saying we've got to respond to this emergency or this situation that's a result of COVID. And so we want to make sure that when auditors do show up, that we have bids, we have documentation of the procurement process that they engaged in based on the amount of funding they spent on any particular item. And we want to support them in making sure that they're documenting those efforts. And in the case of a situation which can arise where there's not really any competition, or that they're engaging in a full request for proposal process is going to take 6 months and we need something next week, that's documented in a way that auditors are going to say, yes, okay, I understand that, and we agree that that's the way that you needed to do this. I think that we want to make sure that we are documenting and preserving documentation at the front end, and making sure that when the annual audit rolls around, that what we're doing is providing our auditors with a 3-ring binder full of all of our documentation and process steps, rather than being reactive to requests that auditors may come up with.
So give us an example. I'm kind of curious. There's a wealth of information that you provided us, ranging from using ESSER funds for salaries. You talked about using ESSER funds for capital projects and making sure that you have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. What are, and I think one of the biggest takeaways that I heard is you want to ask for permission first rather than forgiveness on the back end. So can you provide, of course, keep everything private, but like a horror story, of course, of when you've seen what potentially can happen if a charter school or any school that chooses the latter approach of asking for forgiveness rather than permission, and why it's beneficial to flip it.
Right. So I think that the worst case scenario that you can have is that an auditor shows up after you've spent the money, after the grant performance period is closed, and after the fiscal year is closed. So you do not have the ability to rebook things or move things around, which can be super useful if you realize mid-year through, wait a second, we should reallocate expenses from item X to item Y, because item Y actually fits better into the 16 reasons or uses. And so the worst case scenario is that you end up in a situation after a fiscal year is closed, after a grant performance period is closed, and your auditor is asking you tough questions about why and how you did something with funding, because you may end up paying that funding back if it turns out that your auditor does not agree with your rationale for having used that funding in a particular way, or that they determine that the funding, that the use is simply disallowed. And so we don't want that kind of a situation. And I sometimes counterintuitively to some folks, highly recommend that you discuss with your auditor. This is somebody that you pay to review your financials, and they are a resource for you. And highly encourage you to ask a question of your auditor if you are in any doubt at all as to the allowable use of funding before you make the purchase or before you pay for something or for time. And I think that if you have a situation where you are unsure, how you ask the question is as important as the answer to the question. And so I think that you want to make sure that you frame the question as how do we do this, not can we do this? Because the frame of mind in can we is a compliance sort of frame of mind, and a how do we do this framing around a question is a solutions-oriented framing that I think starts you off in a better spot with somebody who's going to give you some answers about whether or not you can do something. And so asking how do we do this can get you, a path to what it is that you actually want to buy or achieve with that funding, that may, necessarily take another couple of steps in order to get there, but those other couple of steps cover your assets. So you are not in a position at the end of a fiscal year or in another fiscal year where you might actually have to repay funding that you used on something that is disallowed.
Excellent. And then I'm kind of curious, as this expansion of federal funding that's making its way into charter schools, how have you been working with your clients in terms of processes, procedures? Are you making recommendations there? And what are those recommendations?
Absolutely. And really, we sort of take an approach around if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so we explicitly ask our clients, how do you plan to use this funding? Let's put together a document that identifies how much you've got, when you're going to spend it, and on what things you're going to spend. And in California, we have something that's called the Local Control Accountability Plan that is required of every charter and every school district in the state. And that document is intended to be a strategic vision, goals, and strategies for the annual budget for each charter school and each district. I mean, so that becomes the context for this conversation, because we're not, what this funding is intended to do is to support the implementation of that end set of goals and strategies. So the way that we use this funding should support the strategic plan that's already in place and already required of each one of our clients. And so that local control accountability plan can become the context for discussion around how we use these additional federal resources to actually be able to achieve the goals and strategies that are identified in that plan in light of huge impacts caused by COVID. And so the intention, some real intention around making sure that this funding continues to align with what the school has said that they are going, what their business for the year is based on that plan. And we get very explicit about, what positions, if you're going to support staffing with this, you intend to support with this funding. What specific purchases the school intends to make around, for example, instructional software or materials and supplies, PPE, all of those things are documented in these plans. And then we ask questions around the development of these plans to ensure that our schools are thinking about federal procurement guidelines, for example. When we see something that's between $10,000 and $250,000, $10,000 to $250,000, we're asking, make sure you're getting bids on this. I mean, you do have the ability during this response to not necessarily do that if you think this is a sole source, but we highly recommend that you do get those bids and that you do document them, because your auditor is going to ask or can ask. Or
a quick question about that.
Yeah.
Are you meaning about in that dollar threshold, are you talking about like a single purchase or multiple purchases from a single vendor?
Both.
Okay.
So you also don't want to be in a situation where you're making, for example, $10,000 purchases from the same vendor, because that looks like you're structuring the transaction to avoid oversight, which is worse than just putting it all together and making a single purchase. You don't want, especially in California and in Los Angeles County, where a majority of our clients are, we don't need to take actions that create any additional sort of raised eyebrow from our authorizers or our auditors, because they already have a raised eyebrow. So we definitely make sure that we are performing all of those steps, just simply, I mean, as a means of demonstrating that we're being good stewards of tax dollars.
Excellent. And can you talk a little bit about, I think one thing that is interesting is you talked about how you work with your clients to come up with that strategic plan that also is in partnership with the district, which I assume is the authorizer. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So each one of our schools does have to, they have to update on an annual basis, and every 3 years have to fully revise their local control accountability plan. And that document should tie to what the school says they're going to do in their charter, the measures of progress that they identify in their charter should also be in their local control accountability plan. And the tendency in California, at least, is to have a proliferation of plans specific to each one of these funding sources. And I'm not saying that we don't have to do that, because we do. We do create plans that are specific to these funding sources, but we try and make sure that the plans that are created, that are required by our Department of Education, or actually primarily by our Department of Education, that they are aligned, that we do have an explicit conversation about the local control accountability plan. This is what we said we were going to do this fiscal year in this 3-year plan. And in order to achieve that, I think that we need to spend X of ESSER 1, 2, or 3 supporting these functions or these individuals. I will, for example, say that many of our schools have been heavily impacted in terms of enrollment as a result of COVID, which has generated budgetary shortfalls for many of our clients. And so the conversations that we have are pretty explicit about the fact that we still have these goals that we have to achieve against, and this funding needs to support these functions in order to achieve or make progress towards these goals. And so being explicit about the budgetary shortfall, the reason, and the fact that we believe that enrollment will rebound once we're not in a situation as heavily impacted by COVID and families wanting to keep kids home, for example, and that this is a temporary measure with a expected and forecasted rebound of enrollment in the next fiscal year or the next 18 months. So we do try and be explicit as possible, but in linking those plans for the ESSER and for the local control accountability plan. But it's not a requirement of the state at this point, and it's not necessarily something that our authorizer is specifically looking for, because our authorizer is really making sure on the checklist, yes, they have a plan for ESSER III. The checklist does not say, does the ESSER III funding align with the uses that they identified in their local control accountability plan? So that's, I think, an extra step, an extra level of support and thought partnering that we do with our clients in order to make sure that all of our sources are headed the same direction towards the same set of goals and strategies to implement those goals.
So it sounds like that's an additional measure of what you do with your clients to, again, consistent theme of dotting the I's and crossing the T's there.
That's right.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of curious a little bit more on, what actions are you taking in, since we're talking about authorizers anyways and working with school districts, what actions do you take to help ensure your schools are getting funding approved?
So we really sort of focus on process and making sure that that at the outset that the policies that they have in place, the first step really is, did they actually review and accept the assurances and guarantees they're required to accept in order to access this funding?
And that they being the charter school itself.
The charter
right?
school,
okay.
Yes, a school leader has to review and accept these federal assurances, which may be something that's specific to our Department of Education in California. But we do make sure that they, for example, know about these 16 uses of funding, and make sure that the conversation that we have around how to allocate all of those conversations are oriented around those allowable uses. And there's a pretty high level in terms of engagement around stakeholders and use of these funds, making sure that that there aren't any student subgroups or populations that are clearly and markedly being impacted by COVID that are not being supported by the use of these funds. Some of our schools have particular subpopulations that their local control accountability plan specifically calls out as needing additional focus and support, and identify strategies to support those students. So we would make sure that all of those subgroups and all of those populations also are explicitly benefiting and supported through the use of these response funds. And I think we also, circling back to our auditors, we're making sure that as we're developing plans, as we're talking about allocating funds, if we have any question at all, there's always, my first stop is always check our Department of Education website, because they have a ton of information about allowable uses and frequently asked questions, because I'm sure if I have a question, 100 other folks have already asked the same question. And then circling around to our auditor and saying, this is what I found on the CDE website. This is what we're thinking in terms of this use. Seem okay to you? Because this is how we'd like to use it. We also ensure that to the extent required, that our charters that our school leaders and academic teams are making sure that they are engaging with their oversight bodies, their boards, so that their internal oversight, their board has a perspective on how this funding is going to be used, and that they agree as a policymaking body that those are the appropriate uses, and that the funding is equitably distributed and used at the school.
Excellent. And then I was wondering, before we turn it over to questions, because we've got some really good ones in about 2 to 3 minutes, I know you could go on longer than that, but I'm kind of curious, what are you hearing from your schools? And what compliance concerns do you have as schools reopen, new variants impact schools, et cetera?
So thanks for that question, because it's one that we are definitely dealing with a COVID surge in Los Angeles County right now. And I think the response to the question is more questions. And these are the questions that I would ask a school leader as we're going through this process, as I check in with them on a weekly basis. And so I ask about their plans, because some of these funding sources not only require a plan on how we're going to use the funds, but also a safe reopening plan, and asking whether or not, for example, the safe reopening plan still holds water, or if in the current situation we need to be considering other strategies. So do you have a plan, and do you have a contingency to your plan? And do you have expenses that are specific to both, either, that are separate from each other? So if path A is not the way that we're headed now, can we quickly pivot to path B with a different sort of or set of expenditures? Always asking about documentation and how they're tracking expenses. So making sure that they're actually looking for the paperwork that they're going to need in order to justify what they've spent on, and that they're keeping it forever. That if there are any questions about whether or not something is going to be allowable, that we ask that question up front, not at the back end, because we don't want to have spent the money and then find out, oh, we should have done something different. Being solution oriented, when I have conversations, and I make no bones about the fact that I am not an auditor and I'm not a lawyer, and those folks are experts and we should engage with them. But in engaging with them, that we take a solution oriented frame in the question. How can we do this? Not can we do this? And making sure upfront that the procurement guidelines that they intend to use are actually going to comport with federal guidelines. We do need to, not many of our schools make purchases that would get us into a spot where we need to do a formal request for proposals or closed bid But many of our schools are making purchases at the level that would require that at least we document that we collected an appropriate number of bids, just to demonstrate that we're good stewards of the funding. And making sure that if you're funding positions that you keep that paperwork, whether it's a semi-annual certification, a single page, or if you're multi-funding folks, that you are tracking time and effort on a whatever your pay period basis is, and that that documentation is signed by the employee. Especially now, if you're buying COVID test kits, that you make sure that those test kits have an FDA emergency use authorization.
Excellent. And just to, you talked earlier about being cloud-based, and if you're attending today's call and you're in with a smaller organization and not necessarily have those technologies available, when it comes from a procurement standpoint, where Amazon Business steps in is we provide all of that reporting data back to you. You can configure your account to, say, for instance, remove debarred sellers. That's a level of protection we provide. We provide our charter school customers access to cooperative purchasing agreements and then specific budget management tools. So you'll see an email address at the end of the slide, and when the slides go out, if you have questions about how we can help you set those products up, more than happy, shoot an email to us. We'll work with you one-on-one. As well, before we turn it over to questions, if you have questions, if you're California-based and have questions for William, you'll see their contact us link if you're interested in hearing more about their services. So now I'd like to turn it over to Michelle in our last 10 minutes here. We've got some great questions that have come in, William, for you to answer.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. Thanks, William. That was such a great chat and learning a little bit about kind of the process. We do have some great questions, so I'm going to dive into them. One was saying, I'm assuming the federal purchasing guidelines would supplant a school's fiscal policies regarding purchasing. For example, if the school's fiscal policies allow the school leadership or principal to approve purchases below $100,000 without board approval, would the federal purchasing guidelines affect these set policies?
So I think two parts there. You definitely need to demonstrate that you're complying with your individual fiscal policies, but you also do need to make sure that, for example, $100,000 could be as simple as 3 bids. So you want to make sure that you're following both. So the board approval does not prevent you from going and getting those 3 bids. You should have those 3 bids so that you can demonstrate to your board, we went and looked and we're being good stewards of the funding.
Awesome, thank you. The other one is, what has the experience of your client schools in getting timely communications and reimbursements from the district?
So we don't necessarily have a direct line relationship like that with our authorizer. So the district is not handing our charters the ESSER funding. We actually receive apportionments directly from the state for our ESSER funding. We're receiving apportionments essentially based on our spend and reporting that we do on a quarterly basis. So we don't really, as long as we have strong cash flow with each of our clients, we don't really necessarily have the issues with making sure that we need to have gotten the check before we pay the vendor that we bought the thing from. So we haven't had any sort of poor experience around the turnaround between buying something and the reimbursement or the apportionment that we get from the state.
Okay. Another one was, what happens in a situation where a school may have an allowable cost and spent before following the procurement requirements?
That's a good question because that has come up. So I would, in that situation, I would essentially construct a set of support documents that back up the decision that we made. So it's an allowable use. I would, for example, if I were buying a whole bunch of computers and we didn't necessarily go through all the steps I would make sure that I performed the steps that, for example, collecting bids, and be able to demonstrate that the vendor that we bought from was the best vendor to go with. Whether that's a vendor that is the only one that provides service X, or it was the best price, or it wasn't necessarily the lowest price, but it was the best price for what we got because, for example, we got service contracts included with the item. So that was better than going with a lower price that didn't include the service contract. So best case scenario, though, is make sure you have that on the front end. If you've already made the purchase and your purchase doesn't comport with those federal guidelines, I would gather the documentation that justifies the purchase. It's clearly going to be after the fact, and you're still going to have a conversation with your auditor about that.
Okay, is there any situation where the school would be required to pay those funds back if they did not follow that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is absolutely a conversation that you are going to need to have with your auditor. And, this is a point at which you essentially would enter into a negotiation with your auditor about whether or not that they're going to identify that you need to pay it back or not. And that's why I would make sure if this is happening after the fact, that I had documentation that demonstrated that the thing that we bought from the people we bought it from was the best thing for the price we paid.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And then how do you quantify the amount you charge to the grant for a budgetary shortfall due to COVID-19?
So an example would be, say we lost 100 students between what we budgeted when we did budget development, and this for us would be in May and June, and the number of kids that actually showed up. And in California, I think the articles that I was reading said that we lost 150,000 kids statewide. I would print that article and I would then have in my file how many kids we intended and what our enrollment history looked like. And then we can say we had 100 kids who moved out of the county, out of the state, somewhere else because the parents couldn't afford to live here anymore. Their parents lost their, whatever there's a variety of reasons why folks have left LA County. And then the next school year, I would hope and anticipate that I see some kind of a rebound in my enrollment as a result of a future state where COVID is not impacting instruction, and have that set of documents together. And in the current year, what I would be doing is funding positions. In California, about 80 cents of every dollar that we spend in education is spent on people, on staffing. And so that is where the funding is going to get spent. In the case of a budgetary shortfall, I'm identifying reason 16 on that allowable uses is essentially these are resources required to be spent in this way in order to maintain staffing. And so very clearly, our funding comes from enrollment and attendance. We lost 100 kids. We have a budgetary shortfall. And in order to maintain staffing at the levels that we adopted our budget at, we need to use these sources. Excellent.
Thank you. All right. I think that is it for questions. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to kick it over to Patty.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you again. Really appreciate all of our speakers, Christy, Morgan, William, and Michelle. We really appreciate all of you in our audience for joining us today. And if you have any additional questions or would like more information about Amazon Business, you can contact your Amazon Business Customer Advisor, or you can also email customer-advisor-edu-us@amazon.com. If you're not sure who your advisor is, to get connected. We will be sharing these slides, that email address, and other helpful links along with the recording to all of you in an email that will go out tomorrow. Again, thank you for spending a part of your day with us. We appreciate it. And we would like to invite you to visit our website, www.publiccharters.org/webinars, for this, some other great presentations, and some invitations for future events. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.